Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event. This event is designed to roll out the results of a project that was commissioned by the Australian government last year to look at how the United States and Australia, which of course share many interests and many approaches to economic and financial and other cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and to look at how the two countries can work more closely together in advancing interests that benefit our two countries as well as the broader region. And so they've come up with a report. It's actually much longer than this. This is the executive summary, but there is a link to the full report, 80 pages or so, I think. 40 online, that goes into some of the analysis and the recommendations more deeply. But we've assembled a really terrific panel here today to discuss the findings, the conclusions, and specific policy recommendations in 5 areas that were examined, which include infrastructure, investment facilitation, energy, the digital economy, and financial services. And I have here on stage, on the dais with me, Bill Costello, who's Minister Counselor of International Development at the Australian Embassy. Matthew Goodman, who was the Sherpa for this project. He's our Senior Vice President and Simon Chair in Political Economy here at CSIS. Mark Sobel, who's the U.S. Chairman of OMFIF and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and Nikos Tsafos, who's a Senior Fellow in the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS. And so we will talk about the different areas that were examined and get some reactions of the findings and the recommendations. But let me first turn to Bill Costello to give us an overview of why this was, how this idea came to the Australian government, why it was important for Australia to commission this report.
Sure, thanks Amy, and thanks to CSIS for the opportunity to talk about this subject today. So the broad backdrop to this report is probably well known to everybody in this room. There's a lot of change going on. The Indo-Pacific as a dynamic region. The economic weight of the globe is shifting to the region, and those shifts bring with them lots of significant opportunities and also some challenges. And meanwhile, of course, there are challenges to the old international economic order, to the institutional underpinnings of the global economy, and all of that at the same time as we've got massive technological change. We've got some negative reaction to all of that with some protectionist sentiment and so forth. So it means that the task of international economic cooperation is getting more complex and more urgent. Now, in a process sense from the Australian government's point of view, we released a foreign policy white paper in November of 2017, which talked a lot about the Indo-Pacific region that we live in and the type of Indo-Pacific region that we'd like to live in the future. And it has characteristics that would be very familiar to you and supported by US audiences: open, free trade, rules-based order, underpinned by democracies with human rights and personal and economic freedom and liberalism. And that white paper also recognised that there are a lot of trends in the region that aren't pointing in that direction. So it put the challenge to ourselves as a country to both think more deeply but be more active in shaping the Indo-Pacific region that we want to live in. And that's what we're seeking to do. One of the other things that this report makes extremely clear is that the US is an indispensable ally for us in this project, that we can't get to the region we want to live in without the US fully engaged and without working very closely with the US. So in the broad sense, that's the reason why we feel like it's important to keep working on these issues. We're in the market for ideas, and we're always in the market for updating our relationship with the US as well.
Thank you. And let me turn next to Matt. Matt, from your perspective, how does this work really advance U.S. interests from sort of U.S. point of view? And although this is not a representative of the Trump administration's thinking on these issues necessarily. The Trump administration, of course, has rolled out its Indo-Pacific strategy, facing some criticism that there wasn't that much of a robust economic side to the Indo-Pacific strategy, in particular on the trade side. You know, Secretary Pompeo did roll out last July a few proposals in energy, digital economy, and infrastructure. And do you see this report sort of supporting many of those initiatives, or is it quite distinct, or where do you see the overlap?
Great, thanks. Well, thanks, Amy, and thanks to the Australian government for commissioning this report and giving me a chance to work with Gordon de Brouwer, an old colleague from G20 days. Gordon was a distinguished civil servant in Australia who rose to the, well, he ultimately was a secretary in another department in energy and environment, but he was, when I knew him, he was the G20 Sherpa, and I was the yak for the United States under Mike Froman in the G20, so we worked together, and he's a real sort of a hero of mine. He's a really a smart, thoughtful guy. So when he asked whether I'd be willing to partner with him to do this report for the Prime Minister's office, I said, delighted to do it. A couple of other colleagues, Shiro Armstrong and Adam Triggs, joined us as well from Australian National University and did a lot of the actual hard work in this, so thanks to them as well. Incidentally, if you didn't say, Bill, I might have missed it, that there was an event today.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for
in Canberra at ANU to roll out a parallel report here, so a parallel event to roll out the report with all of those gentlemen involved. And I think, look, I think that we don't spend enough time in the economic world talking about Australia, and at CSIS we should do more on Australia as an economic power, because here's the, depending on whether you believe the World Bank or the IMF, this is the 13th or 14th largest economy in the world. Interesting that they differ on that. But that's big, about $1.5 trillion economy. It is, and my Australian friends are going to smile when I say this, given recent politics in Australia, but it's a well-governed country. It hasn't had a recession in, I think, now 28 years and counting. And that's, as an economics person, that's pretty darn good. I'm not sure that anybody, maybe the Dutch did that once or came close. I think Australia may have passed the Netherlands in that regard. So that's a good thing. And it obviously is very important in the trade and investment regime globally, but also in the Asia Pacific. It's been a leader in, I mentioned the G20, where Gordon was a leader in that group on behalf of his country, and a leader in APEC. In fact, Australia founded APEC with our, I think, following behind. So it's influential, and we're allies, we share a lot of values, a lot of interests, and it's really important to try to find ways that we can work more constructively in the economic realm in this important region, as Bill mentioned, dynamic and lots of opportunities and risks. And so that's kind of the reason that we did all this, and we tried to identify 4 or 5 areas that we could find some new thinking about. Not all new, some of it's just reinforcing things that we all know about and have thought about, but we're trying to come up with some new focus on ways the U.S. and Australia can enhance their cooperation. I'm probably being more frank than I'm supposed to be, but we tried to stay away from trade, because although trade is critical to the story, it would have been a sort of lightning rod if we had gotten too much into those issues. We all know those are a bit controversial, so we decided to cover a few other important areas. Infrastructure, investment facilitation, digital economy, energy, and financial systems. And we co-wrote the chapters, divvied them up and shared them, and offered comments, and came up with half a dozen recommendations in each. And I think these are practical ideas for how the U.S. and Australia can move forward and fill out the free and open Indo-Pacific. Just the last point is to respond to you that I think this is consistent with what the Trump administration has broadly laid out as a strategy in the region, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. We're trying to get put a little more meat on the bones of some of the things that have been, as you alluded to, Secretary of State Pompeo had laid out last summer some ideas, and a tiny bit of money, really tiny, but a start. They've endorsed the creation of a supercharged OPIC, which is going to be called something like the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, that starts up this October. We've endorsed that in here and say that's the kind of thing we ought to be doing, and it ought to be working with Australia to find joint projects and opportunities to expand infrastructure, for example. So happy to talk about some of the specific findings and recommendations when we
Great.
get through.
Thank you.
Session.
Well,
Thanks.
let me turn to Mark next to talk about some of the findings and recommendations in the financial sector. The report took a look at finance in the region, and obviously the need for more financial services liberalization, the questions surrounding the IMF reform going forward, and the question of the regional safety nets when it comes to finance in the wake of the Asian financial crisis over 20 years ago. A number of mechanisms, regional, bilateral, were put into place, including the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, CMIM, very difficult acronym to remember, but some other things. And so could you give us your reaction to some of the recommendations in the report?
Great, well, thank you. I too have known Gordon DeBrouwer for many, many years, and I've known Matt for many, many, many more years. And a lot of the financial work in this paper finds resonance in work that was done by an Australian gentleman named Barry Sterland, who was at Brookings for a while and was one of their IMF and G20 reps and a friend and colleague of mine. So it's a great honor to be here. The paper makes some very good overarching points that I want to start off with. And one is that the Indo-Pacific region is dynamic, it's fast growing, it's increasingly vital to U.S. interests. Another is that it's important that regional integration be consistent with an open, resilient, multilateral system. And the third is that in doing so, who could be a better ally for the United States and Australia? I know from years of financial diplomacy that Australia and America are very like-minded on many issues. So turning to the financial recommendations in the paper, so I fully agree that the first line of defense for the global financial safety net is strong policies at home. I also agree that financial sector reform, capital market development are vital for mobilizing capital more efficiently and supporting investment and growth. And I also believe that trade and financial services can support such development, especially if foreign firms bring in technology, know-how, and experience, and et cetera. Now, I want to put some cautions on that last point because we argued that point about foreign firms bringing in know-how with the Chinese ahead of the global financial crisis, and the Chinese financial authorities were actually receptive to the arguments. But then the crisis hit, and the Chinese told us that they really didn't feel they needed to learn anything more from their teacher. And banking crises are always an endemic feature of the global landscape. We had we saw that with the United States. We saw that in Asia in the 90s. So I think the focus shouldn't be on expanding competitive opportunities for foreign financial firms as an end in and of itself, but rather that the Indo-Pacific financial systems, in opening up, need to make sure that firms are well supervised, capitalized, and regulated to derive the benefits from increased trade and financial services. I very much agree with the recommendations in the paper on debt transparency and sustainability. Excessive debt burdens can trigger financial crises. A lack of transparency can be associated with contingent liabilities that migrate to the public balance sheet. They can be associated with massive corruption and the like. And there are a lot of interesting issues about China's role in the region. And I must say, if I digress a second, that I'm much more a fan of the AIB approach than I am the BRI approach. So the paper focuses a lot on global financial safety net and regional financial arrangements and their relationship. In Asia, there's the ASEAN +3 macroeconomic research organization. This is a surveillance arm of the ASEAN +3. It's called AMRO. And then, as you mentioned, there's this CMIM, which is an unused ASEAN +3 multilateral currency swap facility that could backstop IMF lending. And on the GFSN, the Global Financial Safety Net, the paper properly recommends, in my view, that the IMF retain a central role and that the fund's resources be buttressed with the focus on IMF quotas and an increase in the voting power of dynamic emerging markets. And then it also recommends breaking up the tradition of a European head of the IMF. So these sensible recommendations, in my view, are not going to find much traction in Washington, D.C. these days. The Treasury just last week reiterated its opposition to a quota increase. The Treasury appears okay with sustaining the overall IMF resource envelope by expanding the fund's backstop facility. But that means that without impacting quotas, one is not going to affect voting power in the fund. And there are some Asian countries that have a legitimate claim to increase their role in the fund, in my view. And then there's the question of China, which is 6% of the fund, but 16% of the global economy and clearly deserves more weight. Given the tradition of an American heading the World Bank and the Europeans heading the fund, Mr. Malpass's uncontested ascent to the World Bank job, I think, basically has reinforced the Europeans' claim on the IMF seat. So I think that all of this is going to promote drift in Asia away from the multilateral order.
Not our report, but these trends.
Here, the next line I was going to say is contrary to the author's rightfully desired course. Is what I've written. Okay, is that good enough?
Thank you.
Okay, but so I had a few thoughts in these circumstances. So the GFSN is a messy hodgepodge, right? You know, there are sound policies at home, there's central bank actions at home, there's the IMF, there's regional financing arrangements, and then there is no global lender of last resort, but the Fed is about as close as it comes to it, although it has a domestic mandate, not an international mandate. So I think that how these players interact varies and some improvements can be made. So for Asian regional financial arrangements, this comes back to the CMIM and the AMRO, they can still rely on the IMF's technical experience by looking to the fund to lead on surveillance and conditionality. So AMRO could conduct joint missions, surveillance missions with the IMF, and the CMIM should continue to link its resources to those of the IMF and let the IMF lead on program design. So if there were to be a CMIM program with a country that had to go to the IMF, the CIM is structured such that only 30% of the financing the country got would be unlinked to the IMF and 70% would be linked. And who knows how it would work in practice. So let the fund lead on program design. And I guess one last observation, and partly this is because of the distinction between APEC and ASEAN +3, is that these RFAs came out of the ASEAN +3 process, and Australia is not a member of the ASEAN +3. And therefore, it's not a member of AMRO or CMIM. And I think that, nor is it an observer, I think this is something Australia should look at with considerable reflection. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Interesting. And that last was a recommendation in the report that Australia should look to link itself through observer status and perhaps over time more closely to CMIM and AMRO. Can I just ask a follow-up question on CMIM and this regional, how the regional safety net is nested, or, I mean, the point is made in the report that these expansion of safety nets at the global and regional bilateral level have expanded the potential resources for a crisis, which is good. But it's not clear what the coordinating mechanism is, as you explained. And then I think, in addition, because since the CMIM arose in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in 1997, 1998, under Japan's leadership largely. And since that time, there has not been a really serious financial crisis in the region. And so as a result, CMIM has never been tested. And so, as you point out, there's not much clarity on how it would actually work in practice. So what could be done to increase the credibility and the transparency of how CMIM would work in relation to the IMF in a crisis? Is there anything any steps that could be taken that would help clarify that, do you think? That would increase confidence in the system?
Okay, great question. Not a satisfactory answer because, the global financial safety net is, they say, patchy, or I basically think it's messy, right? And as I was trying to say, the roles and responsibilities of the various actors are not clear. The IMF and RFAs did work out a set of principles to govern coordination, but they're a very high level. I know that the CMIM and the IMF have done some test runs or games, which is useful. But I still think that there's a lack of clarity even within the CMIM participants about how it would work. So when it arose, it was partly, as you said, in response to the Asia crisis, where the Asians were not particularly happy with the IMF. But as you've seen, countries like China become a major creditor. They're thinking, well, wait a minute, we got to protect our taxpayer resources. And therefore, in comes the link to the IMF. So 30% unlinked, 70% linked. But it isn't even clear to me were there a situation that the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans will be the main creditors, might want 100% linked. And how would all of that work out? So, I think they should continue the test runs. I think it would be great if Australia were in the mix, because I think it could lend some good thinking and expertise to the effort, and a pinch could be fast on its feet and very helpful. And I can't help but notice one irony in thinking about this issue, which is when the Asians in the 90s came up with the Asian Monetary Fund, the U.S. was not keen on this idea because it was seen as undermining the IMF and the multilateral order. And now you see the Asians basically thinking we do need to link with the IMF to protect our money. Fast forward to the European crisis, and the Europeans are fighting in particular over Greece with the IMF, and the US view was, Europe, pay for yourself, right? First with Greece, it was we wanted the IMF, but then it was Europe, you should pay the lion's share of the financing, and the Europeans want little to do with the IMF these days in that context. And so the Europeans are now talking about a European monetary fund, and it's a pretty hands-off approach. So there's been a role reversal between Europe and Asia over the last 2 decades that I find ironic and interesting.
All right, thank you. Let's turn to energy next. And, Nikos, obviously there's been a lot of changes in the supply of energy resources, especially in the United States. Australia plays a big role, and the technology in terms of extraction and sustainable resources. And then there's also been a lot of change in the demand side in Asia, Southeast Asia and South Asia particularly. So the report goes into, can you give us an overview of how the report looks at those changes and where the opportunities lie for U.S. Australia collaboration?
Absolutely. So thank you very much for having me and for this report. And I think, what's striking to me when I think about the region is it's incredible how much of our future rests with what kind of choices the region makes in terms of energy. Whether our planet will be inhabitable in 50 or 100 years depends in part on the choices that this region makes about what kind of energy it's going to use. And also because the center of demand has shifted to the region, the choices that the region makes reverberate back to the West. The price of solar panels has come down because of what happened in the region, what's happening on the electric vehicle side. So what happens in the region is going to come back to the rest of the world as well. So I think what I wanted to do is pick out some of the recommendations and sort of zoom in a little bit of those into those. I think the overarching objective that I think about when I think of energy in the region is, how do you basically avoid conflict? How do you make energy be part of the solution rather than part of the problem? And to me, as the report rightly points out, this comes down to markets. It comes down to the idea that energy should flow in the region based on market principles rather than politics. It means openness to foreign investment. And it's not just about foreign investment in sort of the traditional areas, but also in new areas. It's the ability to trade not just fuels, but also equipment and technology, and really be able to catalyze the transition to a new energy system. So the number one thing, which I think the report really articulates well, is this paramount, the idea that energy has become largely, with a few asterisks, a commodity, that sort of buying and selling and price is the arbiter of where energy goes, I think is one of the sort of geopolitical blessings of the last sort of 50 years of the world. And keeping that in place is one of the paramount objectives. The second thing that I think about in the region is this idea of the transition to new energy sources. And I think we have a few challenges there. Number one is the human toll of our current energy system is enormous, and much of it is felt in the region. So the World Health Organization says there are 4.2 million people that died in 2016 for ambient air pollution, and 2.8 of those are in Asia. If you look at the cities with the worst air quality in terms of particulate matter, 2.5, of the top 100, 85 are in Asia. It's China, it's India, it's Pakistan, it's Bangladesh. So there is an imperative to find ways to deliver energy to the region in a way that lowers that human and environmental toll. And obviously a big part of the story is the continued reliance on coal. Right now, 75% of the coal that the world consumes is consumed in Asia. And if you look at the world outside of Asia, coal consumption is going down. The Asian market, the coal consumption is going up. And we're going to have some more difficult conversations, because who's supplying that coal? It's Indonesia, it's also Australia. The United States is there too, and the United States would like to be a bigger part of this picture. And so it's going to be a conversation that we have to figure out how to minimize the cost to sort of the environment and human life, and trying to transition that system away from coal. And the thing that worries me a little bit is, most of my background has been in natural gas, so I'm a big fan of natural gas. And obviously what's happened in this country has been transformational. If you look, though, in the region, gas is not doing great. And I think one of the challenges that I see, and the one addition that I would put on one of the recommendations, which is about better gas markets, I mean, some of the challenges sometimes is that if you improve the gas market on its own, you may make gas less competitive against coal, right? So Malaysia is a good example. The price of gas in Malaysia has been going up because it has to. It makes economic sense. But suddenly, gas is that much more expensive than coal, and so the country is using more and more coal. So I think we all have a challenge to try to figure out how to deliver gas in the region at a more economic rate. That the places, this is where the demand is, but if you look at the world, one of the biggest sources of gas demand is in China. And if you trust the Chinese national oil companies, they'll tell you, PetroChina, the largest one, they tell you they lose money in importing gas in the country. Right. So if you're hoping to use gas as part of the energy transition, but the product that you're delivering the buyer says, I'm losing money selling this product, we have to do a little bit better. And obviously, Australia and the United States are the two largest incremental suppliers into this market. The last thing I'll say, and I think the thing that makes me most excited about this region, and I think is on the opportunity side, and the opportunity is really that we're still at the early stages of this story. I was looking at the numbers. You look at Indonesia, and they have 50 cars per 1,000 people. United States is above 800, right? So take Jakarta multiplied by 16, right? It's probably not going to be a fun city, but there's no reason it has to go to 800. We can write a different story. We can talk about mobility in a different way. We can think about how to design our cities in a different way. You look at electric vehicles, and you look at sort of China electrifying its sort of busing fleet in certain cities. You talk about Australia and some of the incredible innovations at the city level about how to redesign cities. So I think there's an incredible story here about we're still part of that growth, and when things are growing, we still have the opportunity to reshape them. And so I think if we start from the perspective of we want to make sure that the energy system is open, transparent, fair, operates on market principles, that you try to make sure that you deliver energy at an affordable level because the region needs energy to grow, but you're mindful of the environmental and social costs and human and health costs of that energy. But then you say, you don't just need to copy-paste what the West did. You can write a slightly different story. I think that's the part that most excites me about the region. I think both the United States and Australia can play a very important role in telling that, in shaping that story.
Great. Let me ask about a couple of other players that you haven't mentioned yet on how they might fit into this picture of U.S.-Australia cooperation. One is Japan, which is obviously Japanese companies are very active in the energy space, have a lot of technology and other things to bear, and is an ally and a close friend with Australia, an ally of the United States, close friend with Australia as well. And then Russia, which is in current geopolitics more of an adversary, but obviously a big supplier of energy to the region. Where do our interests with those players converge and diverge, and does it make sense to think about incorporating them into a cooperative mix of working on the Asia energy
Absolutely.
system?
So let me start with Japan. I think the Japanese are an indispensable market when it comes to Asian energy, and in particular Asian gas, which is one of the areas where both the United States and Australia are looking to expand their footprint. I think what's most interesting to me about Japan is, so the Japanese companies, just to get a little bit into the weeds here very briefly, after Fukushima, they increased their demand for gas, but as nuclear is restarting slowly, and as aging society, not a huge amount of growth, mature market, the Japanese are sort of realizing that if we want to grow, we're not going to sell more gas in Japan. And so they're looking at the region as an opportunity to build infrastructure, to invest in projects, to sell gas. The challenge that I see, and it's not just a challenge for the United States, for Japan, it's also, I think, a challenge for the United States, is that Japan has built a foreign financing structure that's basically, if we're buying gas from you and you use our contractors, we can finance you. And they're just now trying to figure out a system that says, you know what, you're not really necessarily buying our equipment, or you're not selling us gas, we want to sell you gas. Can we find a way to finance that part of the chain? So it's the same challenge for the United States, that between the two countries, the LNG infrastructure in Asia has been built very much with the support of public finance. Even in Australia, the Exim Bank supported LNG exports from Australia. So it's about trying to figure out how do you get new systems that can really meet the new needs, and I think Japan is going to be an indispensable partner in that regard. On the Russia side, I think that obviously Russia historically has built up its energy system to supply Europe. That's the market. Europe has its own challenges in terms of energy overall, also a very mature market, a little bit of anxiety about dependence on Russia, but also a desire to diversify from natural gas. So we've seen Russia over the last 5-10 years really sort of shift its focus, not in terms of taking away from Europe, but realizing that you have to diversify into the region, become an important supplier into the region. The way I think of this is, there's a lot of attention that people that do what I do for a living spend on, are Russia and China friends? Are they enemies? Are they frenemies? What do you make on each individual occasion? I think part of how I think about this is, Russia can be a very important player that actually acts for good in the region because, yes, they're sort of a competing supplier, but they also bring additional gas and oil into the market. They lessen sort of, China's anxiety about energy security. One of the things that I have been writing about for a while now is, the gas story from the West looks great. If you look at the top LNG players in the world, it's the United States, Qatar, and Australia. So if you're America, this looks great. If you're Beijing, this could look a little bit different, right? You're sort of looking at a market out there, and you say, who are the big players? So having alternative suppliers into the region, having alternative supplies that don't rely on maritime choke points, those can have an important role in sort of stabilizing and diversifying the market in a good way. So I think that the challenge for the world is going to be, how do you keep the Russian supplier role into the region as a constructive force rather than some of the externalities that you've seen from Russian supply play into Europe. And obviously, what you can do in Eastern Europe is not the same as what you can do to China. So there's some big differences there. But I think we have to think about the Russian role, not necessarily in a purely sort of negative way. I think there is a positive story there, as long as we can focus to keep it a positive story.
Let me turn next to two areas that are of big geostrategic interest in Washington right now and Canberra, because these are areas where China is making real inroads in the region in ways that in some ways are problematic from a Washington and Canberra perspective. And that's in infrastructure and the digital economy. So, Bill, I'm going to turn to you on infrastructure and ask you to share with the audience how the report views the opportunities and challenges in infrastructure in the region, the dynamics around providing infrastructure to a region that badly needs it. There's a huge infrastructure gap, and a lot of resources are needed to fill that gap. And how can the U.S. and Australia collaborate?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So I think this is one part of, as you say, there's a lot happening at the moment, or at least a lot starting to happen. And this is an area where things were moving while the report was being written. And I think what I'd like to do is sort of give a snapshot of how we see it now. And the context is exactly as you said, this massive underinvestment and requirement for further investment for Asia. The ADB figure that we often quote is $26.2 trillion of investment required between 2016 and 2030, which is just a number that's too big to comprehend, isn't it? I think broadly we and the US and Japan are in a project with two parts that are interrelated. The first part is to try and give countries that are trying to finance infrastructure, given their infrastructure deficits, choices. So it's not to say they shouldn't necessarily take the Chinese option, but let's give them some other options as well. And then related to that is trying to also encourage a different model by which infrastructure development happens. This is something I've heard US Aid Administrator Mark Green talk about quite a bit. We're trying to promote a different development model, one that sees a private sector-led opportunity, and one in which we are trying to create the conditions in which private investment will flow and help to fill the gap, as opposed to the public balance sheet trying to do that. Obviously a pretty complex project and a long-term endeavour, but we've made a start in a number of areas towards, if you like, the sort of the long-term goal. At the multilateral level, I wanted to mention the G20's Infrastructure Working Group. We co-chair that, and the work that was done last year was on infrastructure as an asset class, trying to create the conditions in which the private sector will invest. And of course, with Japan's G20 leadership this year, the focus is more on the quality infrastructure part of the puzzle, which is another very important piece of the alternatives here. We want to make sure that the infrastructure options meet safeguards, they meet standards, they are good, they have a good return on investment, they are sustainable, and they don't unnecessarily cause debt distress. So there's work going on at the G20 level and elsewhere multilaterally. On the regional side, there are things that APEC can do, and we're always trying to support APEC, which often has very sort of practical tools that can help countries. We're working with ASEAN on its connectivity agenda. Again, a sort of a big long-term picture, but we're helping them to sort of fill that out. And then there are a bunch of bilateral and trilateral approaches that are proceeding. On the trilateral side, our leaders announced at APEC in Port Moresby in November a trilateral infrastructure partnership involving Australia, Japan and the United States, and some specific initiatives under that, including an MOU among development finance institutions and a particular PNG project, an electrification partnership. So that's been useful, and people like me are spending a lot of time at the moment trying to give effect to this trilateral infrastructure partnership, and we're doing that in a range of ways. And I think, our aim is to start to provide a positive demonstration effect sooner rather than later. We've been doing some reforms within our own organisation as well, as part of a broader Pacific Islands step up, which we've really focused hard on over the last 12 to 18 months. We created an infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific, a $2 billion initiative. We've given our export credit agency, EFIC, an extra $1 billion in callable capital to allow them to get out there and do more. We're working, coming back to the multilaterals, on some of the platform initiatives with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, which help to create the project pipeline and create perhaps some investment platforms. And then through our development program, of course, we have a lot of work in Asia on the governance side of things, creating the regulatory environment, the procurement and all those other technical processes which actually allow the right investment to flow.
Matt, let me turn to you on infrastructure for a minute. Of course, you do a lot of work in this space with your Reconnecting Asia project and website. But Bill's already mentioned one of the recommendations, which I think seems very straightforward and sensible, which is to develop a vision for infrastructure development and build a consensus around principles that you would push through G20 and APEC on, open and transparent procurement policies and social and environmental regulations and sustainable debt sustainability. But one recommendation I was is a little more interesting or perhaps puzzling, not puzzling, but I wonder how it would work, is the idea of creating a regional mechanism to empower countries to advocate for quality infrastructure with these kinds of principles. And I guess I'm wondering what that would look like, and who is the thought that Australia and the United States would pay for this, or everyone would chip in, or what would that look like in practice?
Okay, before I answer, if we could pause for a commercial break just to say thank you for mentioning Reconnecting Asia. Please go to reconnectingasia.csis.org and check out our map and database. We have been following this infrastructure story across the Eurasian supercontinent for about 3 or 4 years, and we continue to build it out and add new analysis and new data to the site, and it's the sort of basis for my having the ability to answer a question like that, because we've really learned a lot about this story. And I think let me just first sort of foot stomp what Bill said. I think he's touched on all the right issues in terms of the opportunity. I'll one-up him on the incomprehensible numbers. So that 26 trillion is the ADB number. The World Bank has a number of $90 trillion by 2040 globally, of which about half will be in this region. So there's a huge need for infrastructure, and it's going to have to be filled through many different means. But our government's coming in and trying to do, I'd say broadly, kind of 3 things, and they've all been touched on. But one is to establish a set try to socialize a set of principles and standards and best practices around, call it what you want, but quality infrastructure investment or best value or good infrastructure investment. I think that's something that we both bring to our involvement in this activity ourselves, and we have a lot to share with the rest of the region and how to do it the right way. And it gets to those issues of open procurement procedures, adequate social and environmental safeguards, debt sustainability, so forth. And then the second thing, and it's interrelated, but is I think we need to work on risk mitigation, because this is a risky endeavor, infrastructure investment. It's a hard business in the advanced world. If you've got here by metro or through steering around potholes, you know how difficult infrastructure is here. Imagine in Kazakhstan or Laos or the additional complications of political issues, corruption, geography, all kinds of other risks that are associated with this. And so if we want private money to go in, and there is a lot of private money, I mean, we could find $90 trillion in the private sector if you think of pension funds and insurance companies with long-term liabilities they have to meet. This is a good asset class in principle, but they're not going to go into this unless those risks have somehow been mitigated. So that's really what we need to be working on as governments, trying to help deal with some of those risks. And that's, again, interrelated with the third thing, which is capacity building and helping the recipient countries have the technical expertise and the ability to distinguish a cheap and quick project from a good, solid, high quality project that has, from a life cycle cost point of view, it may be more expensive to build in the short term, but it's better maintained, it's better, it has a better life and better economic impact. And so being able to distinguish those things, we can help procurement officers do that. And that's what, to finally answer your question, I mean, that's what that idea of a regional facility was. I don't think we got to the point of specifically thinking about a funding mechanism or a size of a funding or who's going to fund it. I think the idea was just in principle to try to get, maybe through APEC, get the recipient countries together with some of the countries that, like Australia and the U.S., that are investing in this activity to try and help build that capacity and that ability to decide what their development strategy should be and how infrastructure can contribute to that, and how better infrastructure is and sort of more from a life cycle cost point of view, more best value infrastructure can be brought to this game. So we put it out there as an idea. We think getting maybe APEC infrastructure ministers together to talk about it and figure out whether there is possibly a fund associated with that, I think is a possibility, but not one that we decided to pronounce on. But this is a big topic, and one, by the way, one more advertisement, shameless advertising. Stemming from the Reconnecting Asia project, we set up a task force, a high-level task force co-chaired by former USTR Charlene Barshevsky and former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley. We're issuing our final report next Tuesday, the 23rd of April, and we'll have an event here with Charlene and Steve, and welcome you to that, and that'll help flesh out some other ideas for how the U.S. can engage more constructively. And by extension, some of those things are things that, although it's not addressed at Australia, we could do together with Australia.
Great.
So stay tuned.
Well, let me move to a different topic, also of great geostrategic interest right now, especially in Washington, which is the digital economy, and a lot of interest is around concern over what's emerging as a Chinese model in many ways of the digital space. The report touches on a number of issues related to digital economy: good regulation that ensures free flow of data and protection for privacy and intellectual property, the digital divide between developing and developed Asia, and cybersecurity. But you have one line in your executive summary that talks about Huawei 5G technology, and that this conversation around that should require sober analysis. And so I wonder if you could give us some sober analysis of how that conversation around Huawei 5G technology, or the broader issues of Chinese development of 5G and other technologies in digital space are causing some concern in Washington, Canberra, other places, and how it should be addressed.
Good, fair question. We put digital governance into this project because it's just so critical, and it's an area where the U.S. and Australia have such a stake in ensuring that there are appropriate rules for the digital economy, and ones that strike this basic balance between ensuring privacy and security. I mean, sort of those are two parts of a broader point. Balancing that with the need and the imperative from an economic and other perspective for data to flow. Data needs to flow because, if I keel over right now and I need medical assistance, I actually don't want you to ask me if I authorize you to use my medical records from Georgetown University to bring them over here. I just want you to help me. So the data needs to flow. It's not just for economic reasons, though that's obvious as well. And I'd say, by the way, it's not just big companies that trade our data, the banks and all that stuff that's, that has raised these issues, or Facebook or all of that. Small, medium-sized companies need data to flow because they're only going to succeed in a globalized economy if they can get, their stuff traded through digital platforms. And so data flow is critical, but we have to have a bedrock of privacy, sensible privacy and security rules. And so that debate is very fluid right now. There's a lot of different ideas, different approaches. The Europeans have moved ahead with their general data protection regulation, which on one level was sort of, a year ago or so when it was passed, was anathema to most Americans interested in this topic area. And now, last week or 2 weeks ago, you have the CEO of Facebook writing an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, well, maybe we should adopt GDPR, just to show you how fast the debate is moving here in the U.S., that we need a better privacy regime here as well. On the other hand, you got China that doesn't think privacy of individual citizens is a high priority, and on the contrary, wants to have access to everyone's data so they can, keep track of everyone. And that's a real concern should be a concern for 1.4 billion Chinese, but certainly a concern for me. And I think we need to have a set of rules and disciplines. And the point is, the U.S. and Australia made a huge contribution to digital governance and I promised I wasn't going to get into trade, but something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we worked on together, that had in it not only a digital or an e-commerce chapter, but it had a series, a bunch of sensible rules and disciplines on these issues, and we chose to walk away from it, and so we got to somehow figure a way to recreate that, because I think it's, fortunately, Australia's moved forward with CPTPP to advance those rules. We've done some of this in the U.S., Canada, Mexico, a deal, and that's good. We're still moving forward, but I think there's a big opportunity and a need for the U.S. and Australia to move forward and try to shape a sensible set of digital rules. And I didn't really answer Huawei kind of deliberately, and I want to stop because I know the audience you want to bring the audience in to grill us. But I would just say that we didn't start this with a focus on Huawei. When we started this, it wasn't quite the front page story that it is today, and we didn't want to get too dragged down that rabbit hole. But I would say we do say it requires sober thought, and the point is that here's a company that produces great products for that are economical for a lot of companies and internet providers who want to offer telecom services to people around the world. By the way, including in the United States, a lot of rural systems use Huawei equipment. On the other hand, this is a company that does raise concerns about its connections to the Chinese government, and raises issues that have created concerns in the intelligence communities of a lot of countries about the risks of having only Huawei equipment in a new 5G backbone of their telecom infrastructure. So we're all debating this, and I think U.S. and Australia have made a pretty clear decision about not using Huawei equipment in their 5G networks Others are still debating it, Germany, Britain, others. But I think this is something that we think needs to be thought through to make sure that we're getting that balance right as well.
And before I open it up to the audience, I think I'd be remiss to not touch on the fifth area that the report looked at, which is investment facilitation. And it was interesting to me that the report makes the point that investment and facilitation in many of these countries, they do a reasonably good job at the front end of attracting investment into the country. And the back end, but in the middle, in terms of sort of retaining investment through good regulations, there are more challenges. Do you want to briefly elaborate on
30
that?
seconds. I mean, it's sort of obvious that investment is a major driver of growth and development, everywhere, and certainly in this region. And foreign direct investment has been a huge catalyst for growth in a lot of countries. In the region. About a third of global FDI goes into this region, and it's a very important catalyst to growth. It brings jobs, productivity gains. It brings capital. It brings technology, and so it's an important thing to the progress of this region. So it should be encouraged. I think everybody kind of basically agrees with that. What the insight you're referring to is really comes from the World Bank, which in its 2018, I think, global global investment competitiveness report highlighted this point of investment retention. As you said, countries are getting better at promoting investment or giving tax breaks to bring in investment, and they're more or less, they're not necessarily good at, but there are mechanisms for dealing with exit, with dispute resolution or other means of exit, but in the middle, retaining investment, keeping it there, which is a function of good governance and good regulation and rule of law and all these things that are required. Business climate, environment issues is really what we should be putting our policy focus on. So that's really what we wanted to draw attention to in that chapter.
Great. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. We covered a lot of ground on a lot of different sectors that all relate to prosperity and how the United States and Australia can work together along with other partners in the region. Any questions for our distinguished panel? Or rebuttals? Yes, the man here. Could you just wait for a microphone and then please briefly introduce yourself and ask a question?
Yeah, sure. My name's Keith Tuckwell from Tetra Tech. Really nice to hear the views from Washington and Canberra. That's great. Really interested in what you think the views are from Port Moresby and from Suva and from Port Vila and from Vientiane in regards to what you're doing and offering, or we're doing and offering, vis-a-vis what China and India are doing and offering. Is there buy-in? Is there traction? What's your sense?
Bill, you may be best positioned to answer the question about where you're talking specifically about the Pacific Island countries or the broader region,
Pacific Islands are very different to Southeast Asia.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, so they are different, and so the dynamics are a bit different, but maybe there's some commonality. I think the commonality is that everybody wants to see the United States constructively engaged in the region, and even in the Pacific Islands where the US has not been especially present, the US is welcome, and the US just needs to find the right way to get engaged. So I don't think there's any issues there. There's also a lot, others would be, Amy would probably be well placed to comment on this. The amount of debate in those societies and those countries, both in Asia and the Pacific, about the role of China has really gone up in the population, and I'd say among the leadership as well. So I think that's a trend. Particularly on the Pacific Islands, I think, so we have made a very visible show of sort of stepping up and trying to cement, if you like, our position. We aspire to be the partner of choice for the Pacific Island countries, especially those south of the equator. And I think that's been welcomed broadly, and there are some wrinkles in all of that, but we're doing things like enhancing labour mobility options, which is very popular. More finance opportunities for infrastructure is broadly popular. So, I think the change has been well received. The level of political commitment and engagement has gone up, and we have an election coming. Let's hope that is sustained over time. And then if I sort of switch to Asia, I think that it was always true that the Asian nations want a variety of partners. One thing that's true there, and in the Pacific indeed, is that they don't want to be asked to choose. They want to be able to have a smorgasbord of options. And so the better we are at providing good options, the better we will be. So, you know, there's some potential for some pushback. You see a little bit of this in the Pacific Islands, you know, oh, you're only doing this because of China. We have to be careful about that. But broadly, I think there's a lot of appetite for engagement of Australia and the United States in the region.
I'll just briefly chime in to mostly concur, although I would say that the United States is, along with New Zealand and France, a resident power of the Pacific Islands. There are some territories there, the U.S. territories, and then, of course, freely associated states, compact states. So the United States has been one of the largest donors, although not as big as Australia and New Zealand. But over the years has been a large donor, and certainly on the security side, there's been strong relationships, especially in Micronesia. But having said that, the United States doesn't show up in the way that it probably should to some of the key regional meetings, the Pacific Islands Forum, and there's been some effort in the Obama administration and now in the Trump administration to step up our own Pacific Island engagement. And there is real interest in having more American engagement in the region. There's a sense that America, along with Australia, New Zealand, and other countries, really share their values, their open societies, strong religions, strong journalism, free press. And so there's a sense that they're pretty clear-eyed about China and the upsides and the downsides of engagement with China. And I think there is a growing concern in these countries about some of the downsides of engagement with China, some of the things that China brings through infrastructure projects. The Hambantota port in Sri Lanka is seen all over the region, Southeast Asia, as well as the Pacific, as a sort of, case study of what can go wrong. But at the same time, they want engagement with China. They want economic cooperation with China. They just want alternatives as well. And there are interesting dynamics within many of these countries in terms of the government's relations with China and accepting Chinese finance and engagement, and some degree of popular concern and backlash. So it's a good time to step in with alternatives, is what I would say.
Yeah, I think you guys have said it all. Just to flag one more thing, which is that the Asian Development Bank's having its annual meeting in a couple of weeks in Fiji. And so I think that they're going to be trying to probably highlight some of the issues that we're talking about here as well. And obviously U.S. Australia are big contributors in shaping that
yes,
institution.
Here. Could you briefly introduce yourself? Ask a question.
Mike Senko, U.S. State Department, retired. Financial systems you referred to in the second recommended action, the Asia Region Funds Passport. What is that in brief? Who's signing up for it? Who isn't? And what's in it for, again, some of the smaller states in the region, such as the island nations?
I confess, when I read that, I also did not know what the Asian Regional Passport was. Matt, are you best positioned to answer that?
Well, actually, if Mark can help, maybe, but to be honest, you've stumped me. I think this is one from Gordon's side of the Pacific. Actually, I don't see it. I'm looking at the...
Maybe it's in the full report.
Oh, the second recommendation here.
Oh, right, the Apex Asian Regional Funds Passport. To encourage all countries to sign on to and implement the use of Apex Asia Region Funds Passport.
Gordon snuck one in.
You snuck one in. You stumped us. Sorry.
Passporting means, of course, that this is like a huge debate in Europe, particularly with Brexit. So, if a firm is located in London, it can conduct transactions anywhere in the Union, and a predicate for passporting is that all countries should be meeting similar high quality standards.
But like most APEC things, I assume it's a it's a voluntary thing. It's not a formal sort of regulatory endorsement of others approaches or whatever. It's probably it's something that broadly encourages cross-border financial services activity in the region.
A work in progress.
Want to do. Yeah.
Yes, the gentleman in the front row here.
Anthony Orford from the Australian Embassy. Thank you all for your contributions, but a question specifically for Nikos. You spoke of the need for well-functioning gas markets, and in the context of two countries that are selling natural gas, LNG, into the region, the need for well-functioning gas markets is obvious, the need for transparency, openness. But there's that mutual interest, and at the same time we're competitors, we're selling the same product into the region. So in the context of mutual yet opposing interests, how do we as two governments cooperate to improve those markets?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways I think of this. One is you're kind of competitors at the corporate level in a way, sort of. I mean, even in the United States, there's a number of companies that are exporting gas that are competing with one another. In Australia, there are a number of companies that are competing with one another. So I don't see that competitive element as being hugely significant, because in a way the two governments sort of have a broad direction of wanting to support sales into the region, and then it's up to the companies to see who can make the deal work. I think in terms of transparency, this is really a tough one, and if I can do kind of like 2 minutes of sort of geeking out on gas issues. I mean, it's really tough because in a way, historically, kind of gas markets have been, the price has been linked to oil. Contract terms are incredibly non-transparent. You kind of never really know who's selling to, who's selling to whom, but not under what price and under terms. What we've seen historically is if you want to change that and move to sort of a liberalized market where supply and demand sets the price and it has the features that we all recognize as sort of market features, what's happened in the United States, it happened in the United Kingdom, it happened in continental Europe, it usually had a strong government support, sort of a government push that said, we want to change how this market works, we want to support this, we want to open it up, we want to deregulate it. And I think sometimes the challenge that I see in Asia is that desire to open up the market is coming up against a desire for energy security and not sort of messing with the formula that has delivered energy for the last 50 years. And so I think the challenge or the opportunity that I see is to communicate to the region from countries that do have well-functioning, transparent gas markets, that there isn't as much of a tension, right? That you can actually open up, be more transparent without jeopardizing your energy security. Because I think that's really the challenge that I see, say from like the Japanese. If you tell them, do you want a transparent market? They say absolutely. But when you see them sort of in practice, they'll still go back and say, I want to sign some long-term contracts to make sure that I have supply security. So I think it comes down to demonstrating that liberalized markets can deliver security. And it's also one of the recommendations I didn't talk about. It's on the governance side, sort of the International Energy Agency, and the idea of kind of showing that there is a multilateral system we have a multilateral system on energy for oil, essentially. And kind of like all the other fuels are kind of like fending for themselves. And so I think having more engagement on trying to think about, now that gas is becoming more globalized, how do you bring that into the fold of the international governance system? Those are the kind of things that I see as making a little bit of a difference in raising the comfort level in the region with a more liberalized, sort of transparent gas market.
Great. Another question here?
Yeah, Bill Eichhorn, consultant. Just a question, and I tend to ask questions in the energy space, so Nico's probably expecting an energy question, but it's a little bit broader than that. I'm wondering about, did you look at the question of state-owned enterprises and how state-owned enterprises can either be a headwind or a benefit to the kind of collaboration that is being discussed in this report? Because I was kind of scanning it, I didn't really see it addressed specifically. But what is your thinking about state-owned enterprises and how it fits into this?
Well, in the very beginning of the report, we have the sentence that I think is actually probably the most important one in a way in terms of what we're mutually trying to achieve overall in the region, which is both countries share a deep strategic interest in keeping Asian markets open, contestable, and rules-based. And I think, though we don't get into the role of the state or state-owned enterprises in the economy, I think it's implicit in kind of everything we're talking about there. So, I mean, the narrow answer is we didn't really in this report. In other contexts, I and probably everybody on this panel is in some way focused on state-owned enterprises, but we didn't explicitly look at that. But it was implicit in sort of everything we're doing here, that we think, sort of a market-based, rules-based system is the best one across all of these issues across this region. So, but maybe a narrower answer on it, not in the context of the report, but just how to think about state-owned enterprises in the energy space in this region.
I mean, the one thing I would add on the energy side, I mean, I guess two things. One is what we know is a lot of the energy decisions in the world today are driven by governments, right? And so whether it's a mandate or it's a state-owned enterprise, so you can't sort of say, oh, I just want an energy system that doesn't have government in it and hope to get very far. So we have to engage with the public sector, whether it's on the mandate regulation or the state-owned enterprise side. But just to build on what Matt said, when I think of state-owned enterprises, say, in the oil and gas space, I think of the importance of rules and markets, right? So when state-owned enterprises from China go and invest in Australia, they have to behave the way sort of that everyone else behaves in Australia. So you have Chinese companies that have invested in LNG projects in the eastern part of Australia, and they're subject to the same rules, same regulations. They have to behave. So I think the question really is, how do you set up a framework that creates expectations that state-owned companies sort of have to plug into? And obviously, it's going to be different, how a Chinese state-owned enterprise behaves in Australia and Papua New Guinea versus how it behaves in China, and maybe there's not so much you can do about how it behaves in China, but there is something you can do about how it behaves in Papua New Guinea and Australia. And I think at least on the energy side, there's occasionally, kind of like maybe 10, 15 years ago, we're very worried about sort of Chinese state-owned enterprises and where they were going and what they were doing. I think that's sort of lessened quite a bit, and I think it's primarily because we've successfully showed, in most cases, not at all times, that if you have a well-functioning market, essentially the state-owned enterprise is subjected to the same constraints and rules that everyone else is subjected to, and that, in a way, lessens a lot of the anxiety that comes from assuming that because they're a state-owned enterprise, it would behave differently.
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming out and hearing this panel talk about this important project. Please join me in thanking our panelists.